After I discussed the apparent injustice of Jesus dying for sins he did not commit in order to satisfy God, some people offered their explanations of why this was just. Many of them simply restated the idea that guilt can be transferred to an innocent party who can be punished instead, and they insisted that this somehow constitutes a valid mode of justice. But this only serves to completely remove innocence and guilt from the concept of justice. It reduces justice to a system in which any wrongdoing must be made right by inflicting retribution, and that's as far as it goes. It fails to articulate who exactly retribution is to be inflicted upon, because apparently that's not important. Under this system, people are totally interchangeable, and guilt is something that can be passed around like a hot potato, so it really doesn't matter who's punished as long as someone is, and that will somehow restore balance to the universe and make things right once more. Of course, there isn't a single civilized society on Earth that follows this primitive version of justice. The penalties for crime are always intended for the guilty party, otherwise justice is not served. So why make an exception for the execution of Jesus? Some people suggested that we, as humans, don't know what God's concept of justice is. It's something incomprehensible to us, the implication being that we have no basis for condemning his acceptance of an innocent sacrifice. But if that's the case, this also means there's no basis for automatically accepting God's version of justice as valid, and there's no grounds for assuming without question that God probably has a good reason for this. Either way, there's little point to arguing based on what we don't know. Now, others claim that I have no right to question God or reject his idea of justice simply because he's God and I'm not, and apparently you're not supposed to do that. In other words, the first rule of Project Jesus is you do not ask questions. Really, if this is supposed to be an argument, it's about as substantive as saying, "Hey, shut up." Oh, okay, that explains everything. Glad we cleared that up. Another common response was that whatever God does is just, by definition, because he determines what justice means. We can question why a certain act of God should be considered just, and the answer will always be that it simply is, because anything God does is just. But this is entirely self-reliant. Why are God's actions just? Because God's actions are just. It's only a satisfying answer if you accept it as a valid proposition to begin with. Otherwise, it fails to explain anything. What's really interesting is that many of the people who put forth this argument went on to claim that God had to punish someone in order for justice to be served, and that someone ended up being Jesus. This seems to characterize God's wrath as some kind of unstoppable force, like an oncoming train, and Jesus pushed us out of the way at the cost of his own life. But God can do anything, and this also means he doesn't have to do anything. He always has the option of choosing not to act. To say that he's somehow obligated to act means removing his capacity for agency. And if he must act in order to satisfy the demands of justice, this subjugates God to a law that is greater than he is, by requiring him to act in accordance with this law. This doesn't seem compatible with the idea that God, by his actions, determines what is just. How is it that God could be subject to these rules when he can make them up as he goes along? And if a law exists that supersedes God, why not just defer to that law and leave God out of the picture? In any case, there still seems to be no compelling reason why substitutionary punishment should be considered a valid form of justice, or why the sacrifice of Jesus was even necessary in the first place.